Well, hello, everybody. This is Pastor Keith for Trinity Chapel. Thanks for joining with me for another edition of Thursdays Through the Bible. Today, on this Thursday, we come to the Old Testament book of Proverbs. And Proverbs is a really fascinating book for a variety of reasons. Again, like Psalms, which we considered last week, Proverbs has a number of different authors, and it's more of a collection of different writings that were written and composed over a long period of time, and then at some point in human history collected and codified into the form we have them today in our book of Proverbs. Proverbs is a really fascinating book. It's one of the pieces of wisdom literature, as it's often called in the Bible, along with the Psalms and Song of Solomon. It's sort of that poetic section of the Bible where there's lots of Hebrew poetry at play, as well as a lot of lessons to teach practically. The book of Proverbs is fascinating because it does teach a lot of very basic life lessons about how to live in the world. And it's also interesting because it gives all kinds of different scenarios where these things might apply. We'll talk about that more in just a minute. The primary author of this book is rightly viewed as David's son, King Solomon. King Solomon composed lots of Proverbs, and the book of Proverbs contains a lot of his writings. In fact, most of the book is likely written, or at least written under the authority of King Solomon. The book breaks down pretty much into three different sections. You have the first section, which roughly would be chapters 1 through 9, which are more longer sections, more long poem type forms of writing. It is from Solomon. Solomon starts writing the book. He likely composes, or at least under his authority, chapters 1 through 9 are put together. And chapters 1 through 9 really lay out the big picture book, or rather the big picture of the book of Proverbs, which is that in God's world there are two ways to live. And those two ways to live are wisdom and foolishness. And in chapters 1 through 9, as elsewhere in the book too, those two ways of living are personified as two different women, the woman wisdom and the woman folly. Those two different women both entice people onto two very different paths with two very different ends at the end of those paths. And Solomon's encouragement to his readers is to heed the paths of wisdom and go in the ways of wisdom and listen to the voice of wisdom and to shun and turn away from the voice of foolishness. So Solomon's essentially saying what Jesus said when he talked about the narrow and the broad way, right? There's two different ways to live your life, and both of them are going to go two very different places. And you want to choose the wise path. You want to choose the godly path. So that's chapters 1 through 9. Chapters 10, roughly through probably the end of chapter 29, so 10 through 29, consists of lots of short, pithy statements. These are usually even just 2 lines of Hebrew poetry, and they're all sort of these little subsection, these really tiny units of wisdom, where it'll say some contrasting point between a foolish way of living and a wise way of living. Sometimes it's 2 lines that build on each other, so it'll say, first line will be about a fool, and the second line will sort of go deeper into the foolishness of whatever thing that was. So as you read, you'll notice sometimes it contrasts. The wise do this and the foolish do that. Sometimes it will build on it. So to say the wise man does this and he especially does it this way, right? Something like that. That's kind of how Hebrew poetry works in those short little statements that it makes. Once you get to chapter 24, about halfway through chapter 24, there begins a section called the sayings of the wise. So now it's not Solomon himself necessarily writing these proverbs anymore, but the sayings of the wise. You go back to a couple more chapters of Solomon's Proverbs, and then chapter 30, you have the words of a man named King Agur, or the words of Agur, I should say. Chapter 30 is Agur, and chapter 31, the words of King Lemuel. And so just some different composers, different authors of these proverbs. It closes with a very popular Proverbs 31 passage about the virtuous woman. And unlike our modern English translations, the way the Hebrew Bible is structured was originally that the book of Ruth would follow right after the book of Proverbs. And so you could see how that flows, where Proverbs ends with this lengthy description of what a virtuous, godly woman is like. And then in the book of Ruth, you have a very clear picture of what that godly woman would be like, and a story of a virtuous woman like Proverbs 31. Ruth kind of is the original Proverbs 31 woman, if you want to think of it that way. And of course, we could still get the same emphasis still in our Bibles today, even though it doesn't flow quite as well. The Proverbs are really fascinating because Proverbs aren't necessarily these universally applicable, sort of watertight nuggets of absolute truth. Sometimes they are, but a lot of the time in the book, it's sort of situational wisdom. It's how to live wisely in a variety of different circumstances. And that means that sometimes they're not consistent with each other necessarily. I'll give you a good example. This is a very famous one. In chapter 26, verse 4, the proverb says, "Do not answer a fool according to his folly, lest you also be like him." Right? So don't engage in foolish discussion with a fool, because you'll become like him and you'll become a fool too. But the very next verse, verse 5, "Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes." So one verse says, don't answer a fool according to his folly. The very next verse says, answer a fool according to his folly. Well, what's going on? What's happening is it's teaching you that in different situations, different responses are called for. There are times when to engage in conversation and in discussion with a foolish person would just drag you down into foolishness, right? Like Jesus talked about not casting your pearls before swine. But there are other times where somebody's foolish declaration demands a response so that his foolishness is essentially called out and he doesn't get away with his foolishness. So what the proverb is saying is there's times where you should not answer a fool after his foolishness, and at other times you should definitely answer a fool after his foolishness. And it just depends on what situation you're in. So you'll see in the book of Proverbs, it's not always descriptions of the way things should be. It's sort of just wise descriptions of the way things work sometimes in the world, as fallen as it is. And then they're not always sort of watertight. You can't always universally apply a proverb to every particular situation and expect it to work out. Give you an example. There's a lot of proverbs about the lazy man contrasted with the righteous, hardworking man. And the Proverbs many times will say that a hardworking, godly man will become rich and a lazy man will end up with nothing. That's telling you that that's usually the way it plays out. But we could jump ahead to the New Testament and to Jesus' story of the rich man and Lazarus and see that that's not a universal thing, right? We even know the Apostle Paul, for example. He was a hardworking apostle. He didn't die wealthy. He died broke, probably. And so the Proverbs are giving sort of general wisdom about how to live in different situations as you go through life in God's world, but you don't want to make the mistake of pulling them out of their context and making them universally applicable all the time, because that's not true. That's not how they're meant to be used. They're meant to be used as the situation fits, and so they're very helpful in there, but they're not always helpful in every situation. So Proverbs are situational wisdom, essentially, and giving you the tools you need for how to live wisely in the world. Now, if I were to give you a theme verse that really encapsulates the whole book, it would actually be in chapter 1. Chapter 1 and verse 7, Solomon says this: "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction." The beginning of knowledge, according to Solomon, is the fear of the Lord. So what Solomon starts off the book saying is, these are wisdom nuggets that you can use in your life, but they are not wisdom nuggets secularized, right? It's not as if this is just generic wisdom that you can have and live with and enjoy apart from God. No, the fear of the Lord, a covenant relationship with God, a right relationship with God, restored through Jesus Christ, that is the start of true wisdom. And you cannot truly be wise, you cannot truly make use of the book of Proverbs apart from the fear of the Lord and a right relationship with your Creator and your Redeemer. So it's not as if these are sort of secular bits of knowledge that can be enjoyed by anyone, totally apart from a relationship with God. Rather, this is what Solomon and the other authors have learned after lifetimes of living in service to the Lord in a covenant relationship with their Creator and Redeemer. And this is how we are to live in the world that God has made. And we are to live under His authority with fear of the Lord as the beginning of our knowledge. I hope that's helpful to you. I hope you've enjoyed our study today. Until next time, thanks for joining me today, and may God richly bless each one of you.